As scrutiny of transgender medicalization intensifies across the nation and throughout the world, those who have been most harmed by it are raising their voices, testifying in state legislatures, speaking to the media, and participating in documentary films and books. Detransitioners and those who are advocating for them have increasingly punctured the prevailing cultural narrative that is dominant in the corporate media, and some of them have notably filed medical negligence lawsuits in light of the irreversible procedures that were carried out on their bodies, such as the administration of puberty-blocking drugs, synthetic wrong-sex hormones, and surgeries to make them appear more like the opposite sex. We'll hear from both detransitioners and their advocates in this episode of Generation Indoctrination, and we begin with Forrest Smith, a young man from Oregon who now says he began mentally disintegrating soon after taking hormones and undergoing surgeries that left him emotionally devastated and physically maimed. So Forrest, how soon did this process begin where you came to believe that you were somehow the opposite sex, and because of that, you had to alter your body hormonally and surgically?
I began my transition, I usually say either at the age of 19 or 20, because there was a lot of ideology and thinking about it that came before the transition. But when I did begin, it really took off with hormone therapy right away. So I began hormone therapy at the age of 20. I lived for 5 years in my identity. I was in Portland, living in a lot of housing through the homeless youth continuum, which is subsidized, but also private nonprofit social services. There's quite a network of social services that work together. So I was living in subsidized housing in a lot of social services for queer, non-binary, LGBTQIA, the whole alphabet soup services. And at the end of those 5 years, I went through a series of irreversible gender-affirming surgeries. I had the breast implants, which permanently damaged my chest. And very soon after that, I had a double orchiectomy, which permanently sterilized me. That's surgical castration. And I came to regret that immediately, I think, as I was going under. Within a few months, I began to detransition. I suffered immensely in the ensuing months with alcoholism. I was living in poverty at the time. I quickly got COVID. This happened in 2020 during COVID lockdown. They had shut down all surgeries and all elective surgeries, only to open it back up very briefly and rush in a number of trans-identified people for these surgeries. I was one of them. I thankfully got out of it without any more damage because they were trying to sign me up for every surgery they could do to me. And I was on the list for penectomy and a vulvoplasty. The way things happened for me, I was turned around before that, and I'm grateful for that. At the same time, to lose the ability to procreate, it's hard to, I'm glad that no more damage was done to my body. Because spiritually and emotionally, I'd say that that was pretty complete. But I did come out of it alive. And there's certain damages that weren't done to me that I'm aware of from the full sexual reassignment surgery.
So when did you then start to realize that as bad as the damage was to your body, you knew you had to face what is now referred to as detransitioning, that is psychologically reintegrating with your natal sex? How did that process begin for you?
Well, I got sick with COVID, and that forced me to move back in with my parents. I'm sitting in a big, messy room right now. This is my family home, my childhood home, where I've always been able to return here. I'm very grateful for that blessing. So I came back in with my parents, who I had cut off my parents pretty thoroughly through my transition. I was able to move back in with them. I still had the giant plastic boobs inside of me. I had been going through multiple bizarre sort of gender crises at the end of my transition. I had made several attempts to detransition. I was not in therapy. And so the crisis was really boiling over. I had COVID. I was quarantined for about a week, pretty immobilized. I started having all sorts of dreams and visions, and everything started coming up and bubbling up. I started journaling immensely, and I quickly began to detransition, so that by the end of that year, the orchiectomy was in June of 2020. By January 10th of 2021, I had begun on testosterone replacement therapy. I had to really, really search to find a therapist who would take me. I was rejected. I was dumped by therapists. I was ghosted by therapists. Sometimes I would talk to therapists and their advice was that I did not finish the job and I needed to go back for a penectomy. I had to search. I realized I need to find a man. Every single one of my therapists has been a woman. I'm a guy with sexual issues. I've been talking to young, attractive women. There's a conflict of motives intrinsic to that interaction. So I looked for a guy with experience. I found a guy who had 20 plus years of experience with specifically with minor sex offenders. So 13-year-old boys that get in trouble with the law for a sexual offense. And I realized I needed to work with somebody who had that experience with male sexuality so I could talk to him about anything.
Forrest is collecting his thoughts and drafting essays that he hopes will turn into a memoir about this entire experience, in which he details the contributing factors, such as his mental health struggles and complicated family dynamics that influenced his thinking to undergo these medical experiments.
I would say I was kind of pushed and pulled into the medicalization before I had nailed down the identity. And I'm writing about that now. I'm not just kind of winging it. And there's also some evidence in the record. I look back at the record. The first sessions I had in the gender clinic, which was called Transactive. So if you want, how did I get it so quickly? Well, I was going to a place called Transactive that's run by an individual who seems to be missing some screws, who's a trans activist and a male to female. And I think looking back now, I think the person who diagnosed me with gender dysphoria in a single visit was also a male to female. It was a very strange visit and it had me very confused because I knew that I was dealing with pornography addiction. I had seen in pornography themes that were like forced feminization themes, and that was part of this aggravation. That's the accumulation of a lot of psychological issues, proclivities, little things. The pornography is extreme and it's outside of me. And then at a certain point when I was really, really troubled, I was in college, I was about to drop out. Why was I so troubled? It was 100% pornography. Obviously, I could also say that there was some lack of fatherly involvement, paternal involvement. I have an older dad. I'm 28. My dad just turned 80. He has a lot of baggage of his own and he has failing health. I don't have any older brothers living with me. There's a lack of male guidance and the pornography is in that void. And that really seriously disturbed me. I was seriously disturbed in college. I could not focus on academia.
Indeed, it can't be overstated just how relentless the social pressures were within the medical and LGBTQ communities, as Forrest was given many false assurances about medicalizing his mental health issues with experimental drugs and surgeries. These pressures intensified in the past few years given certain political dynamics, and it left him dazed and even more confused.
I was seeing a queer naturopath doctor, not actually a doctor, by the way, not licensed. I was also going in and self-diagnosing myself as ADHD, which I'm not. And I wanted to get meds for ADHD. She didn't want to give me those because that's highly addictive. But she really approved of me having my testicles removed because that would make me this gentle, passive creature. And it would also naturally feminize me without the need for testosterone blockers. So I thought that it was healthy. I'm not that stupid. It was a wild, fanciful thought. And it got sent in. And I kind of forgot about it. My mental health tanked. I ended up on the streets. By the time they brought me in and I had an older transsexual drive down from way up in Washington, drive me to the hospital, spend thousands of dollars putting me in a room, so I can get out of the impoverished situation I'm living in. I was living in a house with a bunch of drugs. I had been using drugs. I went into one of my pre-op meetings on drugs. So it was horrible. There was no consent. And the instant, as I was going under, the last thoughts I remember was looking up at the people doing it to me and thinking, knowing that I was going to regret it. I remember the exact thoughts. I don't really want to utter them, but it was something that months later, I would wake up in the middle of the night, reliving the moment and shouting, no. I remember being wheeled in and it was bizarre. I was being really cruel to myself when I went through with that. The wild, fanciful thought was that I was going to remove the intensity. And as I got closer and I was arguing with myself in my mind, I didn't have any therapy. I was looking for therapists. There was also this surge of zealotry within the community. I think it was 2020. So there is this whole Donald Trump is going to take away our right to these surgeries. Get them now. And there was a whole string of people within the community jumping through these surgeries and having their testicles removed. After I went through it, I was almost I was traumatized me. I was dropped. I had other young men coming to me who had an inch of caution in them. I think they knew that I had detransitioned and they were kind of wanting to know. And I tried to encourage as many people out of it as I could, but I could see that it wasn't working because it was walking on eggshells. And it was traumatic it's just happening in mass.
Forrest said one of the greatest betrayals came from his former church community, which helped encourage him down the path of medicalization and surgery. While he was transitioning to Ramona, the progressives there would tell him how brave he was and were vocally supportive of his new so-called gender identity. But since detransitioning, their narrative has been disrupted. They have moved from support to occasionally uttering snide remarks when he is in their presence. He now sees how they distorted the words of Jesus, particularly as it pertains to what it means to love.
I often think about, just in my own study of the scripture, something that I think about a lot in response to the progressive church, because I still deal with interactions with that former community, and I can tell that I feel judged. I feel pretty shunned. I've had visits from the community in the past where they make strange little comments as though they're trying to correct me. And something I think about a lot is, I think it's in the book of Matthew. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, people think that I've come to abolish the law. That's not true. I've come to fulfill the law. And he also says, whoever says that, down to the letter of the law, down to the mode of the law, whoever says that the least of these laws is not important will be least in the kingdom of heaven. And I often think about that when we're looking at a progressive church that pretty much wants to look at this aspect of Christ's message. It comes down to the spirit of the law, right? And the spirit of the law is love. And they go, love. And then somehow they've just twisted that. All the law, they can say, yeah, the spirit of this law is love. Well, it's also, that law is showing us a model of what love should look like. And if your love doesn't look like that, then it's probably not love. Maybe there's a little bit of love in it, but it's twisted and it's gone the wrong direction.
While there are patterns and similarities in the journeys of all young people who have become convinced that they are somehow trans, the compounding influences often manifest differently in males versus females. Though young men are indeed being swept up into this social contagion, when the transgender craze first besieged the Western world, a disproportionate number of trans-identifying youngsters were teenage girls, who were presenting with gender confusion at previously unseen rates. I spoke with Laura Becker, a detransitioner woman from Wisconsin who took cross-sex hormones and had her breasts removed, to learn what led her down this medicalized path, asking specifically if she ever entertained any hesitation about what doctors were doing to her body, and whether or not they were practicing ethical medicine.
I had done a lot of thinking, but not about biomedical ethics. I was mostly ruminating about my personal abuse history with my father and subsequent abuse from other men in my life, and just trauma-based ruminations. And so the thought process I had was not very informed in terms of the ethics of, I mean, on one hand, there's a cognitive dissonance because on one hand, I'm reading about certain feminist materials about how cosmetic surgery and beauty standards are wrong, to put it very basically. And on the other hand, these same feminists, the liberal postmodern feminists, are saying that's wrong, but you also can liberate yourself from the prison of womanhood and the prison of femaleness and the prison of femininity, performative gender rituals. And so their abstract ideas of liberation then became a solidified pathway that seemed feasible and reasonable. There was no other considerations of the biomedical ethics of the industry or possible corruption that was going on. And because of all the propaganda from the trans community online about how all these conservatives are trying to dismantle trans healthcare, how trans people are being murdered, and how they're so vulnerable and no one understands, and all these really angsty things playing into my trauma-based paranoias and fears, I was just happy and relieved to find providers that seemed to accept me. And I felt very safe with them because I've been told for so long that nobody else understands. This is the only treatment. And these people are kind enough and aware enough to facilitate it. When in reality, now I can see that they were actually being negligent.
That negligence has catapulted Laura to action, as she believes detransitioning was not enough. The process has been so painful, she now feels compelled to speak out against those carrying out these practices and the institutions that enable them. She and her detrans friends are now regularly appearing in public forums, legislative hearings, and conferences, and in documentary films. Such detrans voices, because of the potency of their testimonies, incur the wrath of activists, and their advocacy faces numerous hurdles.
It just started as peer support work. There really wasn't hardly anybody being public. We didn't have any of these organizations. Legislation hadn't occurred yet. So it was very early on in going public. So initially, I didn't have a lot of backlash. It was mostly just connecting with other people who had these medical traumas and kind of just saying, hey, we need to kind of have each other's backs because we can't really go back to anyone in the LGBT community because they're personally been pushing us away after we're no longer transitioning. And then it kind of started to go more on the advocacy route, doing some interviews and writing some essays and things. And just the more that I've done, the more backlash there's been. I've now become very used to it. For example, I just did an event at my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, like last week. And I gave a lecture there and did a Q&A. And there was an organized protest. And they made a whole poster about this event. And they said that I was a, quote, noted racist and bigot. And I'm just like, where's the citation? Because I didn't see any receipts. But they came and they left some notes. There's two different types of, well, actually, there's three different types of dissent that I suppose, or backlash that we receive. The first type is the very immature, kind of chronically online. And that's kind of what I received at the UWM event. They just left notes like, what's wrong with you? Question mark. They said your music sucks because I make music. Like just very childish internet comments that obviously don't really have much impact. The second type of hate is the really vicious, like you can tell this person is very triggered or they have some serious issues, like kill yourself, I hope you swallow some glass, get raped, like really explicit, just degenerate comments. And those again are like shocking, but again they don't really have a lot of power because it's usually like really unhinged people saying it. But the third type is the type that's the most painful and frustrating, is when it comes from someone that you actually know, or someone who's a public figure in some kind of position of power. They'll project things onto you and they'll say, well, your story isn't really emblematic of anything. Like doctors are saying this, politicians, people who have like a larger following, or like trans influencers. When they're dismissing you, it does feel like gaslighting.
While most of the political opposition comes from Republicans, Laura emphasized that it's important to remember that a wide swath of Americans do not favor this medicalized treatment protocol for young people, despite the disagreement on other issues.
I've been thinking a lot more about just how, like PR basically, like how, like to me, these things I'm saying are very objective, but in a lot of people's minds, they're associated exclusively with right wing, homophobic, kind of backwards, conservative values or ideas. And I feel like that's not an accurate assessment. The right has not ever been that into like mental health care.
The broader question is what should be done to help detransitioners. Is there any recourse for them given the irreparable harm they must live with every day? How were doctors and therapists allowed to get away with such sloppy care? These were among the questions I asked Jennifer Law, a bioethicist, filmmaker, and the co-author of the 2024 book, The Detransition Diaries, which documents the stories of several detrans young people and explains the breakdown in medical ethics that led to the crisis.
On one hand, it really depends on how far down the lie that they followed in transitioning and then trying to detransition. To me, the more surgical interventions and the more medicalization that a person has had or done makes it, what does society, what do we owe them, makes it harder. You can't rebuild genitalia that's been removed. Men who've had bottom surgery, women who've had bottom surgery, they're kind of left as is. Are they going to be compensated through big lawsuits? But will that make them whole? No, that won't make them whole. But will it help them? Perhaps, because they'll have a recognition that society did something that was wrong, and they won this legal case. So they're vindicated in one sense. On one hand, transitioners that detransition, you've seen this, I'm sure, in your work too. There's this, well, it's your fault, you did it. You're the one who agreed, you signed the documents. And on one hand, they did. But on the other hand, they were taking their decision based on advice of medical professionals, but whether or not the compensation helps them or not. Because a lot of these people will just have to live forever with the harms to their body and realizing they may have shortened their lifespan. Not only just dealing with the day-to-day, some of these men, they have trouble just doing things like urinating. Just basic things we take for granted, just going to the bathroom and emptying your bladder is a real challenge for these people.
Jennifer's latest film on detransitioners, The Lost Boys: Searching for Manhood, profiles such men who are experiencing those very difficult challenges. But as she and her co-author Callie Fell note in the Detransition Diaries book, this is certainly not the first time in history that medicine has lost its way, and we are already seeing signs of a much-needed course correction.
We have these ebbs and flows. Medicine gets off track, something happens, it gets back on track. Medicine gets off track, something happens. So we start in the book with what happened during Nazi Germany that led to the Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg Code of Ethics. Then we move from that and we look at Tuskegee right here in the United States, the decades of abusing Black men and part of a science experiment that they weren't even aware that they were part of. Then we move into the whole lobotomy scandal. And then we sort of end that section of the book with forced sterilization in the United States. All of these were driven by eugenics, who should have babies, who should reproduce, who's fit, who's feeble-minded, and how we treat people. And all of these incidents along the way had two common themes. They either got back on track and fell apart, and we stopped doing bad, horrible things at the hands of medicine because of whistleblowers and lawsuits. Sometimes both, sometimes one or the other. But that was what raised the public consciousness and let the conscience of the public. Most of us were unaware of what was going on in Nazi Germany. We had no idea what was really happening in the camps. There was little glimpses of people being hauled off and thrown into trucks and taken to Auschwitz and taken to various places. But it wasn't until one Polish Jewish man escaped that he was able to tell what happened, and it got reported in the news, and then the whole world knew, oh my gosh, they're gassing people, they're burning people. And we kind of went, what? This must stop. And then we try to end on a happier note with all the great things that have happened in the European context with backing off, like what's the rush, pull back. All the United States, the battles around the states that are saying, we're not going to do this. This is not going to be done to children. We've had our own whistleblowers in the United States, Jamie Reed, Washington University. We've got quite a few lawsuits now. I think 3 in my state, California alone, as well as others. So we've got whistleblowers, we've got lawsuits, we've got a lot more public awareness that people did this and it didn't work, and they regret it and they desist.
Yet others who are advocating for detransitioners are taking legal action against the clinicians who medically harmed these young people. Medical negligence lawsuits emerged in the past year where young people, with the help of attorneys, have sued the doctors and surgeons that permanently altered their bodies. These young detransitioners, many of whom were transed as minors, now say that they and their parents were misled about the treatment protocol and therefore could not give adequate informed consent. Mark Trammell of the Center for American Liberty is one such attorney behind these efforts. Among the high-profile cases he is working on are the suits brought by detransitioners Luca Hine, Chloe Cole, and Layla Jane Lovedahl, all of whom underwent these experimental procedures as minors. In Lovedahl's case, her physically healthy breasts were amputated in a trans surgery when she was only 13 years old. When Trammell first learned about these practices, he was aghast, and it's a feeling that has stayed with him.
It's horrifying. The first time you hear one of these stories, I didn't want to take on these types of cases. I mean, quite honestly, because the subject matter, the injury, the trauma that these young people have suffered, it's hard to separate what you're seeing at work, right? And then to kind of flip that switch and then not still think about it, right? Because for them, for our clients, they can't flip that switch. For the rest of their lives, they have to suffer from the injustice that they've received, again, at the hand of doctors they should have been able to trust. So it's horrifying. As a Christian, we see that, we know that we are created in the image of a holy God. And to see that just disregarded, and just to see the humanity of our neighbors and children just absolutely mutilated, it's sobering. It's really sobering. I don't use this word lightly. I do believe it's evil, what's going on. The financial motivations, I think, of big pharma, of these hospital systems, these gender-affirming clinics, the money is enormous. If big pharma gets a 12-year-old girl on puberty blockers and on testosterone, they have a client for the rest of that person's life, for the rest of their lives. These gender-affirming clinics that are popping up all over the country are making huge amounts of money off of these procedures. A lot of it is being paid for by states if they're of a certain age, right? In California, we see that. There's a financial incentive through state funding to do this earlier and earlier in a child's development. It's horrifying. It's abuse, and it never gets easier to look at.
Trammell believes that the area where the doctors who prescribed the drugs and surgically operated on these young people are most legally vulnerable is the age of consent. Indeed, how much sense does it make for minors to be able to say that they understand the implications of a drug regimen or a surgical procedure that will, among other things, foreclose their fertility? This, Trammell says, is especially important given other age-based restrictions in society.
We don't allow people under the age of 18, especially you look at our clients' ages when they had these procedures done. They were 13, 15, and 16 respectively. They weren't old enough to get a tattoo. They weren't old enough to get an ear piercing without parental consent, buy a beer, do any of these things. But they were handed a prescription pad by doctors and told, sure, go ahead and amputate healthy body parts. We all see the intellectual discrepancy at play here, right? I think this is an area where they're incredibly vulnerable. And then I think also, again, because we're talking about medical negligence, and there's a standard of care in all negligence cases, and you have to prove in these types of cases that they have a variation here. They've strayed from that standard of care. And so even the most far left, very pro-trans organizations would say, and so WPATH really comes to mind. WPATH really sets the standards, I think, for what have been accepted for the medical establishment here. And even WPATH says you need to put kids on testosterone and puberty blockers for a year before you surgically do anything. Well, that didn't happen with Luca Hine's case, right? The very first thing they did was a double mastectomy, and then they put her on testosterone. So even if you were to apply the medical standards that advocates for this would apply, these doctors at the University of Nebraska Medical Center are in the wrong. And so I think there's huge vulnerabilities there.
The road of recovery that lies ahead for detransitioners is uncertain, fraught with many hurdles. And yet, even amid those challenges, Forrest Smith has a newfound hope, albeit mixed with profound regret. He met a Pentecostal pastor who patiently walked him through a process of reintegrating with his natal sex. But before he did, there was no way around the tough truths he had previously rejected. There is no point in sugarcoating it. The process of recovery for him and many others has often been brutal.
I'm left with an empty scrotum and damaged nerves. Months later, they sent me this horrible email with, I don't know why the hell they did this, just telling me a play-by-play of the surgical instruments they used, the dimensions, the weight of each testicle, and a play-by-play of the processes. They cut me open and cut out my organs and then cauterized. The spermatic cord is a big cord. It's less like, not like a string. It's like if you go outside and you look at a branch of a tree, a lilac. I do a lot of pruning. I'm traumatized. I can't stand the sight of scissors or clippers, and I work with scissors and clippers. It's like it's a weird trauma. I'm traumatized by these objects because they sent me this detailed description of doing it to me, and the nerves will sometimes just start to hurt. It feels like I've been kicked in the balls, or sometimes they say it feels like my balls have just been cut off, and it happens when I'm tired. It happens when I've worked an 8-hour shift. I'm in lower management. I'm in charge of a bunch of people. I stay after work. I do all the paperwork. I'm having a long, long day suddenly for 15 minutes or even longer for a whole 45 minutes or an hour. It just I'm crippled. It hurts in my abdomen. It feels like I've been kicked in the balls. It's a humiliating wound, and I just have to suffer. I don't tell anybody. I have a broken heart, and I feel like I've been trampled on.
But despite the pain and horror, I asked Forrest how the pastor helped him heal, and his response was truly informative.
As for the pastor, it's a good question, and I'll be thinking about it. I think that I was really in a place where I wanted to turn around. The first word that Christ says in the book of Matthew, this is the first word that comes out of, that is reference to Christ, is repent. And I meditated a lot on repentance, and he was non-judgmental. I mean, he saw me, I came in as Ramona, but I could still tell that he was pulling me towards this direction. He just knew. I mean, he has the word and the law written in his heart. He does a really good job at containing even judgment. It's funny, that's the whole idea of being non-judgmental, but we need to have good judgment. We need to be discerning. But the reason is, it's kind of what I would say is you delay judgment. That's what I think being truly non-judgmental is. It doesn't mean you just accept the person. You see that they're a little confused. That's not right. That's a little concerning, but you delay judgment. You hold back on the judgment because you know that that person can change and that the person may be changing. And you don't want to hammer that person in their process of changing and growing.
Indeed, such pastors often hold the key to helping many young men and women embrace the truth of their bodies and pave the way toward recovery. We'll engage those pastors and other leaders who are thinking deeply about these themes next time in the season finale of Generation Indoctrination. Stay tuned.